Students, welcome to today's session of Massive Open Online course on International Economics. In today's module, we will talk about World Production Possibility Frontier and Ricardo. By this time, you are well aware of the person named David Ricardo. David Ricardo's idea of basis of trade that is very popular and probably the most influential theory of international trade is comparative cost advantage theory that we discussed before. And while discussing all those things, we also talked about the production possibility frontier of various countries. Various countries means the countries which are engaged in trade, which are planning to go for exchange in goods and services with others. And then from those production possibility frontiers and curves, we tried to derive the supply curve. And then we also talked about the PPF. If we think of a country which has two components in the sense that which has two parts, which has two states. Why I am saying two? Because the traditional way to look at trade theory or analysis of international economics is to have at least two countries. Now, will there be any interesting implication if we consider both these two countries trading partners together, and if we try to look at their behavior for the entire economy as a whole when these two countries are staying together or these two countries are part of a globe. So our globe, our world, if this globe has two countries, then what would be the shape of the PPF for the world as a whole? This part we slightly explained in our previous module. But now, as we know, PPF is not the ultimate thing that we want to look at, because we have to derive the equilibrium price. And as I said you before, that if the equilibrium prices are different in autarkic situation, means in pre-trade situation, then only it is beneficial for the countries to be engaged in trade. So our main target is to look at the equilibrium price. But students, production possibility frontier alone cannot give me the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price is determined by demand and supply curve, and only by demand and supply curve. So whatever you start with, you have to go to demand and supply. It could be relative demand, it could be relative supply, it could be relative price. Now why I am saying relative? Because usually we talk about a single good, X or Y. So students, you remember a diagram. Try to visualize. On the vertical axis, we conventionally measure price of X. And on the horizontal axis, we measure quantity of X. But if we focus only on X, that is not trade. Because trade means you have to have at least two goods. So why we need two goods? Because without two goods, trade cannot take place. The question is how we can accommodate two prices and two quantities together. So very simple way, on the horizontal axis, you consider relative supply or relative quantities, and on the vertical axis, you consider relative price. Relative price means Px by Py, and on the horizontal axis, you consider X by Y or Sx by Sy or Dx by Dy. Then you are done, because you have relative demand and relative supply, then you calculate the relative equilibrium price. But that has to be done from the production positivity frontier. So what is going to happen to the supply curve of the world as a whole when we take both these countries together? So the shape of the world PPF that we talked before is a kind of kink, but I'll show you again. So in this module, we will briefly touch upon few things that I said before, and then we will move to the relative supply curve, the most important part of this module, the relative supply curve on the world relative supply and demand. And once we are done with that, then the equilibrium price for the world as a whole is determined. And you will be amazed to see that this equilibrium price has some connotation for the autarkic equilibrium price for these two countries in separation. In isolation, if we consider country 1 and country 2, then what is going to happen to their autarkic prices and the relative equilibrium prices for the country as a whole? Wait for a few minutes, then we will get to know, and it is very interesting to understand. Now, so these are the basic things that most of you know, but still I want to give you a chance to recall the whole thing. Prices of internationally traded goods, like other prices, are determined by supply and demand, as we all know. Comparative advantage, we must apply supply and demand analysis very carefully, and then we will go for export of X and import of X, but that is a standard thing. But in general equilibrium analysis, we will consider both the goods together. Now, this is the world PPF. Students, you remember the world PPF. The shape of the world PPF, what we have derived in our previous modules, is like a kinked one. You follow the cursor here. The thick black line from left, from the vertical axis, is coming down, and then it is reaching E, and then it is relatively steep and going down and touching the x-axis. What is the implication? Students, try to remember, because if you fail to remember what is happening there, you would not be able to follow the next arguments. Think of the situation that you are at this point. I am not considering at this moment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll come to those issues later. You are at this point here on the vertical axis Y. You want to produce X. You have two friends. One is efficient in producing X. The other one is relatively less efficient in producing X. If you know that one is more efficient, then immediately you will ask that friend to produce a little bit of X. And who is most efficient in producing X? Who has comparative cost advantage following David Ricardo in producing X? So this part of this kinked PPF from this point to E, this is reflecting the PPF of the country which has comparative cost advantage on X. And once that country's resources are completely utilized, completely used up, then you will go for another friend and you request him to produce some X for you. And then he will follow his technique. And his technique is relatively less efficient compared to the technique of the previous friend. Since this friend is less efficient in producing X, this friend's PPF is relatively steep. So if this is the PPF of another friend, then this part of the PPF reflects the PPF of the less efficient friend. And that is how we got the kinked PPF, and which is called the world PPF. Now the question is, if this is the world PPF, what would be the equilibrium? Because I need to produce two goods. First of all, I will focus only on the production of good X. And then we will automatically understand what is going to happen to the production of Y. You need to just go with the arguments, then you will automatically follow the channels through which the resources are moving from one commodity to another commodity. Now think of the situation, students. I am at this point Y, or think of the situation when price of Y is very high and price of X is very low. you need not to look at the diagram. When price of X is very low and price of Y is very high, are you willing to produce X? I'm pretty sure that we are very rational human being, and when price of X is very low, I'm not going to produce X. Instead of that, since price of Y is very high, I will produce only Y because it is profitable to produce Y and it is not profitable to produce X. I'll come to that diagram in a minute, but before that I want to tell you one thing, that price of X and price of Y in a competitive setup is essentially equal to the cost of production. And in Ricardo, as you all know, we use only one factor of production, and the only factor of production is labor. And in a competitive labor market, labor gets W as the wage rate. And how much labor is required to produce 1 unit of X? That is denoted by ALX. So, in order to produce 1 unit of X, how much money is needed? That is the multiplication of two things. One, how much labor is required to produce 1 unit of X, and how much money one labor is getting. How much money one labor is getting is W, and how much labor is used up in 1 unit of X is ALX. So total cost to produce 1 unit of X is W into ALX. And as you know, and as I said time and again, that the price of the good should be equal to the cost of production if the market is competitive. And here we are assuming that competitive market prevails. Therefore, price of X should be equal to W into ALX. And similarly, if I have another good, the price of Y should be equal to W into ALY. Now, what is Px by Py? That is clearly written here. So, Px by Py is equal to WALX divided by WALY. Cancelling out W from the numerator and the denominator, I have ALX by ALY. And as you know, this ALX by ALY is nothing but the slope of the PPF. And since it is the slope of the PPF, then the price of X and price of Y should be equal to the slope of the PPF. Now students, let me go back. This is the PPF. Now when the price of Y is very high and price of X is very low, essentially your price line is coinciding with the vertical axis. Starting from here, it is coinciding with the vertical axis. If that is the case, then you know from the microeconomics production equilibrium that the production equilibrium will take place at a corner, and this corner is here. So, when price of Y is very high, you are producing only Y, nothing, and nothing of X is produced. Now, gradually I am moving in such a way that price of Y is either declining or price of X is gradually increasing. So previously, if I assume that the price of X is 0, then the slope of the price line should be infinite. Now, price of X is positive. So it is now slightly like this one. If this is, still the corner solution takes place here. If it is more flat, the corner solution takes place here. Because, look, the price of X is gradually increasing. This means price of X by price of Y is increasing, but still you are producing at this point means corner solution. What is the implication? The implication is that price of X is increasing, but still price of X is not so high that that would be able to cover the cost of production. That is why you are still producing at this point on the vertical axis. So for all these lines, for 1, 2, as long as this price line is not coinciding here with this line, this part of the world PPF, your production equilibrium takes place at the point like king, where price of X by price of Y is not equal to 0. It is positive, but still you are producing only Y. Only Y means your X production is 0. Students, you follow. When your price of X by price of Y is gradually increasing, still you are not producing a single amount of X, single unit of X. This means your X by Y is 0. Till you reach a situation or price ratio where your price ratio is coinciding with this part of the budget line. If that happens and if that is 2 equal to this price ratio, then what will happen? If this is the case that this stretch is the equilibrium, then the producer can produce anywhere along this stretch. Anywhere along this stretch means if you are here, X production is 0. If you are slightly to the right of this point, your X production is positive. But X production positive means you are reallocating resources from Y to X. Means your Y production is going down. If your Y production goes down and X production goes up, your X by Y is now positive. Now, if you move further to the right, your X goes up further, Y goes down further. So, X by Y rises further. So, in this way, you reach point E, where your X production is this much and you are reducing your Y production by this much. So, this much of X is produced and this much of Y is produced at most when you follow this segment of the world PPF, and then your equilibrium would be here. But after that, there would be some changes. Now, the question is, what if the price ratio is different from 1 and 2? Or, to be very precise, of the price ratio is steeper than the line 2. Now, before I move to that part, let me make one more thing very clear. Students, you look at this diagram. When the price ratio coincides with 2, this price ratio is exactly equal to the slope of this PPF, this part. So, this price ratio is equating this slope means when the slope of the most efficient country in terms of production of X is equal to the price ratio, then for all the output combination of X and Y that I have explained that are taking place for a single price ratio that is equal to the slope of this segment of the world PPF. And in our next diagram, you will be surprised to see what is the shape of the supply curve. I'll show. Hold on for a moment. Now, before that, if the price ratio is like, the blue curves, blue lines. Look, I have not named here blue lines. All these blue lines have same implication. What is that? So, all the blue lines are tangent with the PPF at a point, and this point is a single point. Look very carefully that all the blue lines are tangent with the PPF only at point E, indicating that whatever be the price ratio, as long as these price ratios are in between 2 and 4, the equilibrium will take place only at point E. This means what? Because your X and Y combination or quantity remains same for all these various price ratio. So previously what happened? For a single price ratio, you produced large quantity combinations, and then you are producing a fixed quantity combination for a set of price ratios. And then what? Then if the price of X rises further, then you will find it that the price line is essentially tangent with the slope of another friend's PPF or slope of another country's PPF. And similarly, if another country's PPF coincides with the price ratio like 4, then you can produce at any point along this stretch. When you are producing at any point along this stretch, this implies what? Various combinations of X and Y could be produced for the single price ratio, and the price ratio is given by line 4. Now, when you move slightly to the right of E, you are producing some more X, and following the arguments that I developed before, that you are reallocating resources from Y production to X production. So X is increasing and Y is declining. So if that happens, everything, or you are producing various combinations of X and Y, means X by Y is increasing further and further, but everything is taking place. All these combinations are at equilibrium for a single price ratio again, and this single price ratio is equal to the slope of this part of the PPF. So it's very interesting that for this point you have X0. For this segment, this is a single price ratio, you have various combination of X by Y. And then for E point, you have fixed X by Y ratio for various price ratios. And then again, for a single price ratio following this part of the PPF, you have various quantity combination. And then again, when the price ratio is rising further, means now Px is so high that people are reluctant to produce Y. So if Px by Py is like this line 5, then again corner solution takes place. But the difference is that now the corner solution takes place at this point, not at this point. So at this point means you are producing only X and your Y production is 0. So X by Y, something positive by 0. You can understand what is going to happen. So all these interesting dimensions can be summarized in this diagram. So what I said is that at the very beginning, when Px by Py is very low, you are producing 0x. 0x means your X production is measured along the horizontal axis. So your X production is 0, means essentially you are on the vertical axis. So this is a part of your supply curve. Now, then when you have a price ratio that coinciding with this part of the PPF, then you are producing a various combination of X. This. But all these X's are consistent with this price ratio. And then you reach this point. At this point, you have various price ratios, but your X is constant. So you have here, your X is constant. You have various price ratios. And then again, you have this line where X goes up for a same price ratio, means the same price ratio, and your X is going up. And then again, you have your X here, only X, where Y is 0. So X is constant now because this total amount of X is produced. So X becomes constant here for any price ratio you consider. So what is the supply curve then? This, and this. So all these supply curves are corresponding to the price lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is the thing that I explained before. Now here, the point is that this is Sx and Px by Py. But Sx is not the only thing that we are interested in, because what I said is that we need to have relative supply curve. Relative supply curve means X by Y. Now you remember, students, what I said. When I am producing more X, I cannot produce X out of nothing. In order to produce X, I need factors of production. Where can I get these factors of production from? Because my total factors of production are already used up in X, already used up in Y, sorry. So if I want to produce more X, I need to reduce the production of Y. And if I reduce the production of Y, then some factors will be reallocated or moved away from Y sector to X sector. So X is going up means Y is going down. So here, when I'm saying that I'm moving in this direction, this means the value of X by Y is increasing. So my relative supply curve for the entire diagram for a kinked PPF like this one would be like this one. And this is called step supply function, famous Ricardian step supply function. Ricardian step supply function is often used to explain a lot of other issues. Now, That's not the end of the story, because I said at the very beginning that we need to determine the equilibrium price. And supply curve is not all. In order to determine the equilibrium price, I also need to have the demand curve. Now, if my supply curve is like this 1, 2, 3, and 4, this looks like a step of a house. So that is why it is called step supply function. So let us superimpose the demand curve. So let's see, the demand curve is passing through zone 2. If the demand curve passes through zone 2, the equilibrium price is equal to ALX by ALY. Means, students, you remember, this is the point that I said that this ratio Px by Py, which is equal to ALX by ALY, is nothing but the slope of the PPF of that country which is most efficient in producing X. So, as long as your relative demand curve changes, but still it is within this zone, your equilibrium price must be equal to the autarkic equilibrium price of the most efficient country in terms of production of X. Now, zone 3. If your demand curve passes through this zone, then you have the equilibrium price slightly more than ALX by ALY. This is the equilibrium autarkic price ratio for the country which has comparative advantage in X. So it is greater than this. So now you are having a situation where the price ratio is more than that country. Whether it is less than another country, that I don't know. I need to wait for another more minute to know that. Now I have not drawn that diagram. I am leaving it to you to think of that diagram, and I am giving you some hint here. Say your relative demand curve is passing through this zone, zone 4. If that is the case, the equilibrium takes place at this point and the equilibrium autarkic price is here. Therefore, I may have 3 consecutive situations. One, where the equilibrium autarkic price ratio is equal to one country's equilibrium price, or the other country's equilibrium price, or it may lie in between these two. So the bottom line is that for the world equilibrium price ratio must lie in between the equilibrium autarkic price ratio for the trading countries. It cannot go beyond that. That is a very important proposition of Ricardian model for the world supply curve or step supply function. And we need to remember for the remaining part of our life that the equilibrium price ratio must not go beyond the autarkic equilibrium price ratio of the trading countries. So, students, what are the conclusions and takeaways for this lecture from this? So, if you do not consider the possibility that one of the two countries does not completely specialize, then we can have this kind of framework. Then the normal result of trade is that the price of traded good relative to that of another good ends up somewhere in between its pre-trade levels in the two countries. So, this is the most important takeaways. And the effect of this convergence in relative price is that each country specializes in the production of that good, zone 2 and zone 4. So one country is specializing either in X or in Y, or conversely. So in which it has the relative lower unit labor requirement. This means it has comparative cost advantage. And the last one, the rise in the relative price of X in home will lead home to specialize in the production of X, that I have been trying to convince you from the very beginning of today's module. And the fall in the relative price of X in foreign will lead foreign to specialize in the production of Y. That's one country specializing in X, the another country will be specializing in another commodity. And that's all for today's module.